And you've criticized the governor in the pandemic over his initial back to school guidance, and because he refused to run CARES Act spending past anybody. But generally, it seems sentiment in the state is that New Hampshire's fared comparatively well through the pandemic. What would you, as governor, have done differently?
Well, credit to the people of New Hampshire. Our healthcare providers are frontline workers. They're doing whatever it takes, no matter the risk, to keep our state and our country afloat. And we have just a tremendous workforce in New Hampshire who is bending over backwards at every turn for our community, for public health. Just like Trump, Sununu punted and passed the buck on schools to local level. No public health standards, no clear guidance, no additional financial support for schools who are already struggling. Just like Trump, Sununu has refused to adhere to the medical experts on masks. No statewide guidance on that, including in schools. And it's something that's common sense. And we're the only state in New England without a common sense public mask requirement. In terms of moving forward, helping families. We got to do that. Paid family medical leave insurance is critical, not just prior to COVID, it's critical right now in COVID. It's been vetoed twice by Chris Sununu. Housing protections in COVID. We put together legislation to protect renters and homeowners, including from Wall Street banks who are foreclosing on people all around New Hampshire right now who have been crushed by this economic crisis, falling behind on bills, and now are losing their homes. And Chris Sununu allowed the moratorium on foreclosures and evictions to expire. In addition to that, vetoed legislation, common sense legislation, to protect homeowners and renters. And this is about how we move forward and who we look out for and how we get out of this mess. We got to get out of this mess in a way that works for working people and working families. That's what I've done my entire life, Bill. I grew up in a working class family. Unlike Sununu, my dad wasn't governor. My brother wasn't a U.S. senator. I was never gifted a ski resort. My dad worked in a furniture factory for 45 years. Same one, on air conditioned, doing the same job for 45 years. My mom, part-time jobs, including the night shift while raising 4 kids. And right out of law school, served as a legal aid lawyer with New Hampshire legal assistants for about a decade, fighting for low to middle income families and seniors and veterans, fighting for veterans who have fought for us for the VA benefits they earned, they were entitled to, helping people during the last economic crisis, the Great Recession, including battling Wall Street banks who were foreclosing on people back then. So many of the same people who fell through the cracks during that economic crisis are falling through the cracks once again in this economic crisis. We got to look out for them. Worker safety means public safety. Paid family medical leave insurance, minimum wage. Chris Sununu gave himself a $31,000 pay increase while he's vetoing minimum wage for frontline workers, prevailing wage, basic economic things to help move forward. And Chris Sununu, at this point, as far as I can tell, hasn't even articulated why he's running for a rare third term as governor. What's his plans? What's his plans on COVID? What's his plans to help working people and working families get out of this mess? And all we've heard back to 2019 spending levels in the state budget. Literally. You know what that means? The healthcare investments that we made, including behavioral health, with overdoses going up during the pandemic, mental health problems exacerbating, ER wait lists going up, including children, all of that cut. Education funding, the $140 million in new education funding for our schools, cut if you go back to 2019 levels. So Chris Sununu is fundamentally mismanaging the state budget by not making sure that we hold our communities constant, our state budget constant, and using the CARES Act money appropriately. He could, under the revised U.S. Treasury Secretary guidance, make sure that our budget is held constant. We protect taxpayers. He's not doing that. And in fact, he says he wants to go back to 2019 levels. So Bill, that's a long answer to your question, I know, but there's a lot there. And there's a lot to talk about in terms of how we move forward.
Well, yes, and you're clearly you have very strong feelings about it. But it is a long answer, and the question really was about what you would do. So you mentioned the CARES Act money. Uh, Given that opportunity, what would you be doing with it?
Well, in terms of what we would do, in terms of what I just talked about, I've been leading on paid family medical leave insurance. We'd sign it, move forward with it. Minimum wage, move forward with it. Housing protections, move forward with. Actually do a school reopening plan, move forward with that. Do a common sense mask requirement. Join the Northeast Regional PPE Purchasing Partnership, so New Hampshire's not left out and left behind in PPE, and letting everybody fend for themselves. You can use CARES Act money to do that. You can use CARES Act money to support workers and families. Here's a question that I have for everybody who's watching this, and certainly Bill, for you and your board. Chris Sununu took unilateral control over $1.25 billion in CARES Act money allocation to the state of New Hampshire. Unilateral control. How much of that $1.25 billion did you get? Bet you didn't get any. You know who got some? Who got a lot of it? Big corporations, including campaign donors, corporate campaign donors of Chris Sununu, to the tune of $350,000 a pop. Meanwhile, working people and working families are taking it on the chin. Our communities need supported with CARES Act money. Housing needs to be supported with CARES Act money. The form to get CARES Act money for big corporations was literally about a half a page, Bill. The form to get housing assistance out of the CARES Act money was 9 pages initially, and now they've trimmed it down to 2.5. But renters and small landlords are being left out and left behind. Only about 3% of that money has gone out the door, literally. So you get the money out the door for people who need it, for people on the ground who are suffering. Tens of thousands of people are out of work. Hundreds more are losing their homes. We have worse numbers by any measure than Maine or Vermont. We have numbers popping up in schools, and we need to use the CARES Act money to support the real issues on the ground. With 5 or 6 weeks to go, Bill, before school started, Chris Sununu threw up his hands and, just like Trump, passed the buck on schools. No public health standards, no reopening guidance, clear guidance, and no additional financial support. Now, Maine, speaking specifically about the CARES Act money, Maine dedicated additional CARES Act money, not strictly the education pot money of the CARES Act money, but the unrestricted, to help its schools with reopening. Chris Sununu has not dedicated 1 cent additional to schools to help with reopening out of the unrestricted pot of money. He has, however, diverted some of that money to private prep schools and religious schools. And he's diverted some of that CARES Act money to an anti-abortion, quote unquote, counseling center. No money going to women's health care, and no additional money to our schools. And so this is fundamentally what's at stake. He hasn't managed the money to go out the door to people who need it, including our schools. And on the ground, what we propose in a school reopening plan, Live Free and Learn Safe, is roughly $100 million of the CARES Act money to go to our schools to provide for, among other things, number one, medical grade N95 masks for all of our educators on the ground. The average teacher spends $423 out of pocket each year in school expenses to do their own job. They shouldn't spend any more money out of pocket to be safe at school. That's number one. Number two, reviewing, modifying, and upgrading the HVAC and air quality systems. Number three, 5 reusable cloth face coverings for every student in the state. Bill, North Carolina did that. If North Carolina can do that, New Hampshire should be able to do that. Helping with the plexiglass around the desks and in the buses. Helping with paid sick days for schools on the ground. Basic things. These aren't revolutionary concepts, but they're common sense concepts that are a function of input that we receive from public health experts, including former commissioner of HHS, Ned Helms, who helped with the plan, parents, families, administrators, teachers, educators. So using the CARES Act money to deal with the real issues on the ground. And 5 or 6 weeks ago, before school started, all people on the ground wanted was some semblance of certainty. What Chris Sununu delivered was complete chaos. And under this notion, by the way, Bill, of somehow local control, but it's not like the virus changes form if it's in Keene or Manchester. The virus is the virus, and public health standards should be put in place, including what happens with when a kid gets sick, what happens with buses, what happens with meals and cafeteria, and providing that those standards, not just winging it, which right now is what's going on. Schools are just told to call HHS and have an ad hoc conversation as things bubble up. That's not leadership. So we need to address the problems on the ground. And so in housing, the economic problems, the public health problems, moving forward with assistance for our schools, real public health standards for our schools. I'm of that fundamental belief we are all in this together. Chris Sununu has told our schools and our families and our students, you're on your own. That wasn't right. And if he was going to do that, by the way, he should have done it 2 months earlier to allow schools more time to prepare. So, and small businesses. Bill, when this so-called Main Street Relief Fund was created, Senator D'Alessandro and I wrote a letter to Chris Sununu and Jerry Little, the head of Gopher, and said, let's prioritize real Main Street businesses, like the Main Street businesses in Keene that are suffering, restaurants that are suffering. We specifically highlighted restaurants. Prioritize them. That's not what happened. And what happened is the eligibility factor for that business relief fund was $20 million in annual revenue. The Business Finance Authority's definition of a small business is 5 million or less, and their capital access program for a definition of a small business. And most people suggested 1 million or less to really target small businesses and really target Main Street businesses who are suffering the most. That's not what Chris Sununu did. He did 20 million, and he gave out $350,000 a pop to big corporations. And so that's not right. That's not looking out for small businesses. So these are some basic things that are the building blocks for how we move forward in a constructive way in this public health and economic crisis that's really crushing families. Last point, and we certainly can talk about any of these things at even greater length, but childcare. There's about 20,000 parents statewide that still don't have access to childcare. And that's a workforce issue. Just like paid family and medical leave insurance, if you value work and you value family, you should do paid family and medical leave insurance, and you should assist with childcare. That helps those families, but it helps local businesses. And so there was a $25 million fund that we advised, and by we I mean the Democrats in the state Senate, be created to help assist childcare facilities, but we advised more. And that hasn't been deployed in a way that really has assisted childcare facilities on the ground and opened them up. That's number one. Number two is we also passed legislation to make sure that working families have a meaningful access to childcare help. That was House Bill 1246. That was vetoed. Among other things in that bill was also nursing home assistance and an independent audit review of what went wrong in our nursing homes, because we have amongst the worst in the nation crisis in our nursing homes here in New Hampshire. So these are all basic things. So Chris Sununu has either not done these things or he's vetoed these things, and he doesn't have any plans for the future. Fundamentally, every campaign and every election is, what are you going to do for the future? What are you going to do to help people who need it? And we've laid out, and we've just talked about several items that are constructive, common sense paths moving forward that will help people on the ground and businesses on the ground.
So, Dan, you mentioned small businesses, and that's one of the things, and we asked readers what they're interested in asking candidates about, and our Citizens Agenda survey showed small businesses was one of the topics. So the CARES Act money is supposed to be spent by the end of the year. So if you were elected, you would become governor in January. That would be something in the past. But there's every indication that this crisis is not going to be over at that point.
Yep.
So if you take over in January as governor, what are you going to be doing for those small businesses?
So first, just unpacking a little bit there, Bill. The one, the CARES Act money needs to be encumbered by the end of the year for expenses incurred by the end of the year. It doesn't have to necessarily be spent by the end of the year. So just the, so number two, in terms of what it could be used for right now, in this fiscal year in the state budget, and we mentioned this earlier, in this fiscal year in the state budget, we're down about 143 million, give or take a few million. The audit's going to be completed over the next several weeks, but it's not going to shift that much. It typically doesn't, but about 143 million, that could be taken care of with the amount in the state treasury right now in CARES Act money, and holding constant and protecting taxpayers and protecting our communities and that community support, that record community support bill that, you know, Senator Khan and myself and others developed in that last budget can be held constant, and we can protect taxpayers. Chris Sununu has yet to do that to sustain that state budget. So that's a critical feature of what should happen now. And if it hasn't happened by the time of the swearing in, we will do. Third, obviously the federal government's working on and potentially going to pass another package, but we'll see what happens there. The upshot is this, is that as we move forward on day one, this budget is the biggest issue and the biggest issue that the next governor and the next legislature needs to deal with. And I was a legal aid lawyer during the last economic crisis, as I mentioned, where the approach in that budget was to decimate the budget by our Republican colleagues back then, including Bill O'Brien. And when I was serving as a legal aid lawyer, 2/3 of my colleagues lost their jobs at a time when the need was greatest to help people with housing and homelessness and unemployment insurance and job training. And I was managing the Housing Justice Project at New Hampshire Legal Assistance, making sure that the casework and staff and everybody, we could deal with that crisis in a way that's constructive and help people stay in their homes and find housing, find affordable housing, and combat homelessness. And that budget, though, Bill, and the reason why I'm talking about this is because it's what's about to happen. Because it's winding down this year. Next year, it's going to be over 200. We haven't done formal estimates yet on the Senate Ways and Means Committee, but it's going to be over 200. And the question is, what are you going to do? We heard what Chris Sununu is going to do. He wants to go back to 2019 spending levels, which means taking out all of that education funding, raising property taxes by at least 140 million on hardworking grant staters, putting additional pressure on our communities, cutting out the behavioral health initiatives that we put in to deal with those crises that were crises prior to COVID-19 and are exacerbated under COVID-19. So first and foremost, A, you want someone who understands the budget, and then B, you want someone whose guidepost is looking out for people who fell through the cracks back in the last economic crisis and are falling through the cracks now, and looking out for our communities and middle-class property taxpayers. That's what I'm going to do as governor, Bill.
So where would you find the revenue?
Well, first and foremost, we need to continue the pathway of what I've called progressive budgeting, which we've done in the last budget. Thomas, one of the things that we did in the last budget is do business tax reform, which meant that generally speaking, businesses located in New Hampshire would pay less, and businesses located outside of New Hampshire that sell a product or service into New Hampshire, like Netflix, would start to pay. And that's in part how we developed the most progressive budget in state history, the biggest public school education budget in state history, with 140 million in new education spending. Roughly right now, there's about 50% of corporations that don't pay anything under our business tax code. And the business tax is the biggest chunk of the state budget. So there's a whole host of things that need to be explored and continue to be explored in terms of business tax reform and closing what I call loopholes in the business tax code to make sure that businesses in New Hampshire and residents in New Hampshire are treated fairly, and we take care of the support for our communities and take care of those basic, fundamental, and foundational services that are critical prior to COVID-19, even more critical right now. So there are a whole host of measures, including continuing the pathway on conformity with the recent federal tax law changes, including closing some of these additional loopholes, including offshore loopholes, among others. And so these are some of the measures that can and should be explored and taken. And of course, we're going to look to see what happens with the federal government and see what kind of support comes in. Hopefully there is. If there isn't, it's going to be another tough budget. This last budget was tough because the current governor didn't want to make progress, including on education. Every time he wanted to negotiate on the vetoed budget that he vetoed, he wanted the education funding out. And we said no, and we kept that in. And so he wants to go back to 2019 spending levels. I want to protect that budget and move forward. Obviously, a lot of those decisions are going to be contingent upon, in part, what the federal government does in terms of an additional assistance package.
I just follow up quickly on the possibility of further federal assistance, because the legislature, yourself included, have been in a fight with the governor over spending the federal money that's been granted to the states. So in January, you become governor, and let's say there's a legislative committee, fiscal committee in the legislature that you don't like. Are you going to just go ahead and spend the money on your own?
No.
Or are you going to?
No, not at all, Thomas. And the unbroken bipartisan tradition of New Hampshire governors, Craig Benson, John Lynch, in a time of emergency, is to go to the fiscal committee to work in conjunction with the fiscal committee to authorize expenditures. That's what I'm going to do. We got to get back to that bipartisan tradition. And obviously, there's litigation on this that's ongoing. In terms of the legislature, the fiscal committee suing Sununu for breaking that bipartisan tradition. We need to get back to that. And this touches on an overarching difference in approach between me and Sununu. There's a reason why he has a record number of vetoes. 79 vetoes, 65 of which, Tom, had bipartisan support. Many of them had unanimous bipartisan support, but he still vetoed them because he doesn't work with the legislature. He doesn't work with the executive council, and he hasn't worked with surrounding governors, including on regional testing and PPE partnerships. And so he doesn't work with folks, period. In fact, this approach, I think, is best exemplified with Chris Sununu's veto of addiction treatment services. Senate Bill 5 in 2019 was a bill to stand up and maintain addiction treatment services across the state, including in Manchester. So part of the bill was to support some of the transitional housing services in Manchester. It was needed. It was necessary. It was vetoed. We had gotten a 24-0 vote in the state Senate. 24-0 vote. All the Democrats, all the Republicans. And he vetoed it anyways. And we scheduled the veto override right away because it was emergency support to stand up those services that were needed. And our Republican colleagues, because Chris Sununu said to them, and this is public now, your vote on veto override, it's not about the issue or your constituents, it's about me and protecting my veto. And they changed their votes. And that was the salient moment when I decided to run for governor, because it was broken. It's broken because of Chris Sununu. Getting back to bipartisan collaborative work is what we need to do, especially right now. We need to work together. And I remember going home after that veto override and talking to my wife, Erin, and saying, look, this is crazy. This is not how it should be done. And that was the salient moment that Erin and I decided we got to do this, because if we're not going to be able to make progress unless we win this race, period. We need to work together. And I know it's easier. Trust me, I know it's easier if you just do stuff on your own. That's life in general. But that's not how democracy should operate. And that's not how New Hampshire government operates. And that's what we need to get back to doing. And if we had gotten back to doing that, a lot of these disputes over CARES Act money or schools or even paid family and medical leave insurance or some of these critical issues that are necessary right now for working people and working families, I bet you we could have made a lot more progress on that. But look, that approach, this approach that Chris Sununu has taken, sort of my way or the highway, is just like Trump. It is. And it's no surprise, by the way, he calls himself, in his own words, a Trump guy through and through. You better believe him. That's his approach. And sure, he smiles to the camera and on press conferences, but he bear hugs Mike Pence and Donald Trump behind your back. And that's what's at stake in this race as well.
So, Dan, since you brought up the vetoes, which obviously we plan to talk about some anyway. 2 years ago, voters elected majorities in the House and Senate of Democrats. That puts you in a leadership role in the Senate. But they also returned Chris Sununu, a Republican, to the governor's seat. So how is it only incumbent upon him to compromise and work with the legislature? Doesn't that work both ways? The voters seem to have spoken and said, we want a split here. We understand both sensibilities.
Yeah, it isn't it? And with I think we've seen is situations like net metering, each one moving closer and closer and closer to his position. Sorry, we're working on the here. But in terms of net metering, 3 bipartisan net metering bills, bill closer to Chris Sununu's position, but not accepting any of the. We've compromised and compromised. 79 vetoes, 60 of them had bipartisan support. And things like independent bipartisan redistricting is something that everyone thought Chris Sununu was going to sign. All indications there was he was going to sign it. And then he vetoed it. There was indications that he was going to sign, or at least he gave indications privately that he'd sign insurance coverage for reproductive health care rights. He ended up vetoing insurance coverage for reproductive health care rights. He has been going forward with voter suppression legislation, Senate Bill 3, House Bill 1264, and get this stuff to his desk. I'm telling you, the singular obstacle to meaningful and bipartisan progress is Chris Sununu. It's not Republicans or Democrats in the legislature. Most of that, like I said, most of that 65 to 79 vetoes had bipartisan support. Out of politics, got a 24-0 vote. Independent bipartisan redistricting was a unanimous vote. We got close to unanimous votes on net metering, and they're still vetoed. And all of the efforts to move and move and move. Obviously, he has signed legislation, including legislation of mine on prescription drug relief, legislation on clean water that we put together. But far too often, in record numbers, he has vetoed bipartisan legislation, common sense bipartisan legislation, including to help folks in this pandemic. We've talked about some of them, but child care assistance, nursing home assistance, An independent audit and review of what went wrong in our nursing homes, vetoed. I also mentioned insurance coverage for reproductive health care services. And just like Trump, he has in the past worked to defund Planned Parenthood. He has not supported he didn't support the backfilling of Title X funding for women's reproductive health care services in the state budget. And he diverted CARES Act money, literally, CARES Act COVID relief money, to an anti-abortion, quote unquote, counseling center rather than supporting actual healthcare services on the ground. So this all adds up to a very problematic situation, Bill, with someone who doesn't really like to work with other people of either party. And let's talk about his first term, because it's not simply about his inability to work with the current legislature. He couldn't work with the former legislature either. His two top priorities were so-called right to work, to weaken collective bargaining rights for workers for better wages and benefits. There was bipartisan opposition. And he went into a Republican caucus and said, your vote on this, it's about whether or not you're a Democrat or Republican, and it's whose side are you on? That's public now too. And that wasn't greeted very well, because that's not how you communicate and work with people. So it's not surprising a bipartisan majority said no to Chris Sununu's effort on so-called right to work. His other effort that was stopped in a Republican legislature, his major priority was vouchers. And that was stopped. We worked together with our Republican colleagues in the legislature to stop it. So he has shown that he can't work with whatever the legislature looks like. And he has shown that he has vetoed record numbers of bipartisan legislation. And he has shown he can't work with the executive council. And he has shown he can't work with surrounding governors. I don't think there's even one regional initiative that he has been able to sign on to, including on PPE, including on testing. So look, we've done hundreds of hours of work, hundreds of hours of bipartisan work, Bill, hundreds of work reaching out, including to the governor and his staff. And in many cases, the signals that you get and the information you get is contrary to what ultimately happens. And in some cases, there's no signals or no information or no communication. And you saw recently when he vetoed 1/3 of the pieces of legislation that we worked on. He said, I forget his exact quote, but those are long bills. I don't know if I'm going to read them. I'm going to err on the side of vetoing them. So that is a Trumpian approach to governance. That's not working together. And my entire career, I've worked together with folks. I was a legal aid lawyer for about a decade, worked with other stakeholders, worked with folks on the ground, making real progress, helping people. Ran for the state Senate in 2014 out of that prospect of bigger, broader change and helping even more people in public service. And in the state Senate for 3 terms and as majority leader, looking out for working people and working families every step of the way, and always, always, always trying to find compromise. And we've found compromise time and time again. We've passed a lot of really good things, but all too often it meets the veto pen of Chris Sununu for one reason or another, most of them political.
I would like to pivot to a different topic now. For the last few months, we've all been pretty focused on the COVID crisis, but New Hampshire has another big problem that's been dealing with for a long time, which is the opioid crisis. If you're elected, how would you approach that issue? And what do you think the biggest challenge would be in approaching that issue?
Well, thank you very much, Mia. And this particular issue has been exacerbated under COVID-19. Overdoses and overdose deaths are up under COVID-19. And access to treatment services, we still have the second worst treatment services in the country with the second worst opioid epidemic in the country. And so here's where we're at. Chris Sununu created something called the Doorways Program, which despite the best efforts of folks on the ground, has largely been a doorway to nowhere. There's no back room, so to speak. There's no inpatient treatment capacity. The beds aren't there. The intensive outpatient isn't there. The respite and the recovery housing capacity is not there across the continuum of care. So it's one thing to do an intake and a referral system. It's another thing to have a place where people can get referred to. That's the problem. And this problem, there's really good people working on the Doorways program, no doubt about it. But what they need is capacity on the back end so that they actually can refer people to the services that they need. So we've, if not already, sometime today, we're releasing our healthcare plan. We're going to replace the Doorways program with a program we call Doorways to Recovery, which actually focuses on recovery. And that includes respite care, that includes inpatient, intensive outpatient, and recovery housing. One of the first recovery housing bills was a bill I sponsored in 2016 that we got through with bipartisan support. And then Governor Maggie Hassan signed it. We started down that pathway, and that's a critical part of the continuum of care. So what happens when you get out of an intensive 30-day inpatient treatment program? Well, some people have a place to go. Other folks don't. And if you end up, couch surfing with your friends, you end up in all likelihood in the same kind of situation. Supportive housing, affordable housing, and recovery housing with services, real recovery housing is critical to that. So Doorways to Recovery is about treatment across the continuum of care. So that involves a couple of different things. One, it involves the actual bricks and mortar, which needs to be invested in. There's a number of different ways to do that. And we showed how to do it in part with the recovery housing, working through New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority to go out to bid, to leverage private and federal dollars to create recovery housing. That's just one example. Second, it's the personnel. And part of that is reimbursement rates. And the reimbursement rates for substance use disorder treatment services need to be equitable. And part of the reason I led the effort on getting mental health parity and addiction equity requirements, including market conduct reviews about how insurance carriers treat providers on the ground, is because those reimbursement rates are a big part of why treatment capacity is not built out in New Hampshire, both in terms of the private pay and the public pay and the Medicaid side. So we enhanced, by we I mean the legislature, enhanced the reimbursement rates in the budget, recognizing this problem. Chris Sununu a few months ago unilaterally cut that out of the budget, literally. The other thing that we put in the budget that's part of the personnel problem is attracting and retaining the workers on the ground, behavioral health workers, to get the job done. A key part of that is the state loan repayment program, otherwise known as SLRP. And I happen to think that the SLRP program needs to be expanded and the support deepened so we can create a big gulp, not a slurp. That's a joke that usually gets some laughs, but not today. But in any event, we need to make sure that the student loan repayment program really works. That's a key feature of attracting and retaining those behavioral healthcare workers on the ground. Not incidentally, I guess, Chris Sununu recently cut that too. And so not only is the Doorways program, which has a lot of great people working on it and are working really hard, been largely a doorway to nowhere, we don't have the advancements in reimbursement rates and in attracting and retaining the workforce that needs to be there. And in fact, it was unilaterally cut by Chris Sununu. So this is a major distinction in this race. We know how to move forward on this. We know treatment capacity is it. We know we don't have it. And the question is, are we going to finally build it out? And our Doorways to Recovery program does just that. And it's critically important to do it right now. As I mentioned, Mia, overdoses and overdose deaths are up under COVID-19. It's only gotten worse. And in addition to all of that, we do have to, I think, recognize that so often co-occurring with substance use disorder is mental health. And we have a mental health crisis in the state too, prior to COVID-19, and that's getting worse too. We have folks who are waiting in emergency rooms for needed, timely, and necessary mental health treatment. Think of it this way, like if you break your ankle or you have a heart attack, you don't wait in an emergency room for treatment. We shouldn't be treating mental health any different. And we took steps in the last budget to help deal with this, including a bill I sponsored, Senate Bill 14, to establish a statewide children's system of care. It's a key recommendation of an adequacy and enhancement report and review of New Hampshire's child protection and children's mental health system. A statewide mobile crisis intervention and stabilization team to reach children in distress, whether child protection involved or not, in their community to provide needed, timely, and necessary and appropriate mental health care in their community, preventing hospitalization, preventing going to emergency rooms. We pass it. We funded it in the budget. And if we go back to 2019 spending levels, that's out too. We funded in the budget. And despite the fact that we did that, it still has not been stood up by Chris Sununu. He hasn't even gone out to an RFP. And there's plenty of organizations ready to go because we've worked together in a collaborative way to pass this. In fact, Senate Bill 14, we passed 24-0 out of the state Senate. And he has refused to stand it up. And now, last week, I need to take a look at the recent numbers, but as of last week or the week before, it's some 20 kids were waiting in emergency rooms in New Hampshire for mental health treatment. And so we got to recognize that this is co-occurring. We got to deal with it across the continuum of care. That's critical to making progress on this crisis. Last part on this, Mia, we need good jobs opportunities for folks in recovery. We talked about continuum of care and housing and stabilizing people, but we also need to allow for and ramp up the public-private partnerships on job training, apprenticeships, certificate programming, the kind of collaborations with Keene State and others that make sure that people get into the new jobs of tomorrow, because we know that housing and services and ongoing treatment are critical on the pathway of recovery, but economic security is critical on the pathway of recovery too. And so making sure that those jobs of tomorrow, whether they be in broadband or housing or healthcare or clean energy, the open jobs right now, that folks have a meaningful opportunity to be trained up and get skilled up and matched into those positions, folks who are in recovery. We passed legislation, Senate Bill 2 in 2019, to do just that, including specifically targeting and doing outreach for people in recovery to make sure they have those jobs opportunity. Senate Bill 2 was vetoed by Chris Sununu, had bipartisan support. We put a good chunk of that into the state budget. We work with your state senator, Jay Kahn, on doing some other initiatives too, the Graduate Retention Incentive Partnership, among others, we put in to the budget. And a lot of these services that we put into the budget have not been stood up or implemented. And that's where I go back to overall. This is fundamentally about managing the budget in a way that looks out for people who need it most. And that is what I will do. Making sure all these programs are stood up to make sure they do what they were intended to do to help people who need it most. I'm not going to unilaterally cut addiction treatment services or mental health treatment services, or as this governor just did, just like Trump saying you support prescription drug relief, but Sununu cut out our low-income seniors prescription drug relief program out of the state budget. He did that too. That's not what I'm going to do. We're going to focus on managing the budget in a way that looks out for people who need it most, and looks out for our communities, and looks out for property taxpayers. And so, Mia, your question goes back to that larger issue of how we manage this budget in a way that looks out for ordinary folks.
Obviously substance use issues and mental health issues are kind of part of a bigger problem, which is healthcare and accessing healthcare.
Yeah.
What can be done here in New Hampshire to make healthcare more affordable and accessible?
Well, thank you very much, Mia. part of our healthcare plan that we released today, we lay out a series of steps of what could be done. And what we need to do in terms of affordability is make sure, in line with the conversation we just had, that those high intensity, high cost services that are so often treated in our emergency rooms, like behavioral health, when that happens, those costs are spread over everybody. They're spread over everybody. And that's one of the reasons why we have the highest healthcare costs in the nation. We have the highest premiums, highest copays, and highest deductibles right here in New Hampshire under Chris Sununu, in part, because those costs that are incurred with emergency room treatment, because we don't have the preventative care and the care across the continuum of care and behavioral health services, so people end up in the emergency room. If you negate that by investing in and doing the continuum of care across the continuum of care and behavioral health, you mitigate a lot of those costs that are spread over everybody else. We have talked about using the 1115 waivers as a way to maximize Medicaid and federal dollars to help with insurance in the state and help with people who, in some cases, have lost insurance. Uninsured rates are going up. So it's not just the cost. Uninsured rates are going up in New Hampshire. And we need to make sure that those folks who, in many cases, have lost their insurance because they lost their job and it was connected to their job, have access to health insurance. And so there are different ways to do that, including using the 1115. But we also need to make sure that we made Medicaid expansion permanent. And I know that the enrollment numbers on Medicaid expansion have gone up too recently, and that makes sense because tens of thousands of people have lost their jobs. But we're not going to be sending the right signals if we don't make it permanent. I was the lead negotiator on Medicaid expansion reauthorization 2 different times. And I can tell you, we got it done. We worked together in a bipartisan way. However, what we heard time and time again from providers on the ground is that the lack of certainty, because of doing sort of 2-year reauthorizations, impacts their long-term planning. And by impacting their long-term planning and having this kind of disruption, that affects access to care, and that also affects costs. So we need to send the right signal and permanently reauthorize Medicaid expansion in the next budget. That's critical to doing. We can, as I mentioned, take further steps on prescription drug relief. I led the effort at the State House to get bipartisan prescription drug relief this past year, including importing safe, low-cost drugs from Canada. In addition to that, capping out-of-pocket expenses at $30 per month for insulin for the roughly 130,000 diabetics in the state of New Hampshire. And so that's real relief. It's the most progressive insulin price cap in the country. We got that done. But as I said, Chris Sununu cut out a program that we put into the state budget to help low-income seniors who are among the hardest hit in this pandemic, to help them with prescription drug costs, including low-income granted state seniors who fall within the so-called coverage gap or donut hole, as it's sometimes referred to, in Medicare. About 25 other states have done this. New Hampshire hasn't. We did it in the budget. Chris Sununu cut it out. We need to put that back in. We need to assist senior citizens on Medicare with those prescription drug costs that are out of pocket, whether in the donut hole or not. There's a lot of seniors that are being hit pretty hard with prescription drug costs in New Hampshire, and we need to help them. Other states have done that. We should do it. That's part of our healthcare plan that we released today. There's a lot of other different components, but one thing that we talked at the outset about that I would like to highlight here again is paid family and medical leave insurance. When we talk about paid family and medical leave, sometimes we forget to talk about the medical part. And we know that, at least from surveys on the ground, that the number one reason why people do not get into an intensive 30-day inpatient drug treatment program is because they're worried about losing their job and they're worried about their family's economic livelihood. And so it's a barrier to recovery. It's a barrier to combating the opioid epidemic. It's also a barrier to our caretaking crisis in the state, as we have a aging population, and people in the workforce are caretaking for their parents or grandparents at record numbers, and having to choose between work and caretaking is not something we should put anyone in that impossible position. We value work, we value family, we should value the proposition that you shouldn't have to choose between the two if at all possible. In addition to that, obviously there's COVID has added another layer to the need for paid family and medical leave insurance. And if that had been in place prior to this pandemic, if Sununu hadn't vetoed it, not only vetoed it, auctioned off a copy of his veto at a partisan political fundraiser, had he actually signed it, so many people would have had relief. So many people would have access to that insurance at a needed and timely way during this pandemic. And I bring this up because this is about costs in the system too. Because the failure to access preventative care, because you can't do it because you're worried about losing your job or you're worried about losing pay, that results in much worse medical conditions down the road, which are higher costs, and those costs are spread over everybody. So another one of the reasons why we have the highest healthcare costs in the nation in New Hampshire is because of the access, the lack of access to paid family and medical leave insurance, where people deal with medical issues as they arise and get preventative care as necessary, rather than the medical situation evolving to a point where it's high cost and high intensity. So paid family insurance is a critical component of any healthcare plan, and it's in the healthcare plan we released today. Lastly, we got to talk about choice and reproductive healthcare rights. Reproductive healthcare rights are on the ballot in this race. They're on the ballot up and down the ticket. And with the unfortunate passing of Justice Ginsburg and what's happening at the federal level, with Trump pushing through a conservative justice, and at the New Hampshire level, with an open New Hampshire Supreme Court position that's been held open by Chris Sununu for 16 months in order to get his conservative pick through, on the hopes that he wins a rare third term and there's a conservative executive council. All of this puts choice front and center in this race, and it needs to be. I'm pro-choice. Chris Sununu's anti-choice. He says he's pro-choice, but there's no discernible evidence of that being the case. And this is a critical healthcare issue. And so let's look at the facts here. Chris Sununu was the deciding vote to cut off funding for Planned Parenthood, just like Trump. And just like Trump, Chris Sununu supports anti-choice justices like Brett Kavanaugh. And Chris Sununu just vetoed insurance coverage for reproductive health care services, and he diverted COVID relief money to an anti-abortion, quote-unquote, counseling center, while not providing any support for real reproductive health care services on the ground. So Chris Sununu's anti-choice, I'm pro-choice. I will nominate a pro-choice woman to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. We'll go through the process that's laid out, work collaboratively with the Executive Council, but I will definitely be nominating a pro-choice woman to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. Choice is a key feature of any healthcare plan, and it's part of the healthcare plan that we released today. It's something that is at stake in this race and up and down the ballot in 2020.
So, Dan, we are getting almost to the hour mark, and we do have a couple of things left to go. We want to make sure we get in. I think you've probably gotten about as many words in an hour as anybody we've talked with, except maybe Steve Marchand. He's pretty exuberant as well. I know that Mia wants to ask a little bit about some social justice issues. But if I can, just before that, because it's a never-ending issue in New Hampshire. Uh, Education funding and property tax equity. You have promised not to raise or implement broad-based taxes, as has the governor when he's run. It clearly, with the lawsuit facing the state over this issue, school funding is broken, at least for property poor communities. Is there a solution to that, or do we simply continue to try to move local property taxes around to address it?
Well, thank you, Bill. I mean, there's certainly two things that are kind of in flux today. There were oral arguments at the New Hampshire Supreme Court on the Conval case. Obviously, there's a school funding commission that we funded in the state budget that continues to do its work, and there'll be a report forthcoming. But here's what I can say as a threshold matter. A key distinction between me and Chris Sununu is Chris Sununu wants to go back to 2019 spending levels in the state budget. What that means as a threshold matter is that the record school funding that we put in that last budget, securing an additional $140 million for our schools in public school education funding, would be gone under Chris Sununu, and property taxes would go up. What we did in that bill, as you may recall, is we did full day kindergarten for the first time in New Hampshire history. Over Chris Sununu's objection, he had tied kindergartners to Keno revenue. We untied kindergartners and treated them like any other grade schooler in terms of the state support for full day kindergarten. We stemmed the tide in stabilization, and we did, for the first time ever, property poor school district disparity aid. That was in that budget, and we need to protect that budget. So first and foremost, as a key distinction between me and Chris Sununu is protecting that budget versus going back to 2019 spending levels. Next, we have to build off of it. Obviously, the two things I mentioned will inform how we build off of that. But I don't believe a broad-based income or sales tax is the right way to go. I don't support a broad-based income or sales tax. Look, there are plenty of opportunities to build an even more progressive budget. And let's look back to the last economic crisis and talk about that budget again, because it's a good analog, at least in my view anyways. In that budget, Bill O'Brien came in and decimated the state budget. Absolutely decimated it. Reduced taxes, reduced fees, created loopholes, almost all the loopholes benefiting those at the top and big corporations in our tax code. Part of the reason why 50% of corporations, to Tom's questions earlier, part of the reason 50% of corporations don't even pay, because of the way that Bill O'Brien decimated the existing structure of our state budget. So much so, Bill, that Maggie Hassan's first budget as governor had less dollars in it, unadjusted for inflation, than Craig Benson's budget 8 or so years prior, literally. That's what Bill O'Brien did. Now, he didn't do it by getting rid of a broad-based income or sales tax. And to me, implementing a broad-based income tax doesn't make any sense, especially for frontline workers who right now would pay it and are already struggling with property taxes. So what we need to do is protect the budget and then build off of it. Obviously, like I said, those two things will inform it. But going back to the conversation we had with Tom earlier, there are opportunities to build an even more progressive budget. We need to make sure that we do that. We need to make sure that we end the reality that New Hampshire is one of only 6 states that doesn't do anything for pre-K. One of only 6 states that doesn't do anything for pre-K. And I happen to believe that the best investments we can make as a society are the investments we make in our kids. They're Aaron and I's kids, Iris and Josie, who go to public schools. It's their future. It's our collective future. And every child, regardless of their zip code, regardless of where they live, deserve a foundation for success and opportunity that's as strong as a granite under our soil. And so that's what I'm committed to doing. There's a lot of different ways to get there. I just don't think a broad-based income or sales tax is the right way to go.
All right, and like Bill said, we want to pivot a little bit to social justice issues. Yep. The Commission on Law Enforcement Accountability, Community, and Transparency recently released a whole bunch of recommendations. What do you think about those? And do you think they'd be effective in addressing these social justice issues we're seeing today?
Well, I support all the recommendations. We should implement them, and I think there are recommendations that we have to, they're going to be helpful, but we got to go beyond that. And so here are a number of things that we need to do, including finally move forward with marijuana legalization. That's a criminal justice issue, but it's a racial justice issue. And during the primary campaign, I was very clear about my support of it, and ultimately working with Councilor Valinsky, we adopted his marijuana legalization plan, which I thought was well thought through and comprehensive. So we need to move forward with that. In addition, we need to, and as I proposed, an Office of Racial Equity in the governor's office. Not too far from Keene in Vermont. Vermont has an Office of Racial Equity in their governor's office, which works to identify systemic practices and policies in state government that have a disproportionate negative impact on communities of color. We would staff the director of the Office of Racial Equity would be a person of color. That would be staffed with a statistician, because having done the statewide analysis of impediments to fair housing choice for the state of New Hampshire, in my capacity managing the Housing Justice Project at New Hampshire Legal Assistance, I know that you need that statistical background. So you'd have a statistician to help with that. And in addition to that, the office would work to involve communities of color in key decision-making processes in the state, and work to recruit folks to potentially fill vacancies in key posts in state government, to make New Hampshire government look a lot more like the people that it serves. Part of what the statistician would do is look at statistics, and I agree that we need more sunlight on the statistics, the arrest rates and that kind of thing. And we need that disclosure, and the statistician and the work of the Office of Racial Equity would look at that as well. Beyond that, Mia, there are things that we need to do in terms of criminal justice reform. We need to protect and continue to protect bail reform, something I led on, that Governor Sununu has signed 3 different times. We revised it a couple different ways, but worked collaboratively to get that done. And the basic premise of that is that no person should sit in jail pending their trial of their guilt or innocence simply by virtue of they can't afford to post bail. And this was an issue that disproportionately affected communities of color. So fundamentally, in bail reform, we reworked it so that to the extent that someone is in jail pending their trial, it focuses on dangerous people and people who are not danger to themselves or others, who can't afford to post bail, are able to be with their family and keep their house and all the other kinds of things pending their trial of their guilt or innocence. That's good for everybody, including property taxpayers who foot the bill for our prisons and our jails. So we need to move forward with common sense criminal justice reform above and beyond police reform. And Mia, this also transcends housing justice and economic justice as well. And we have a housing crisis in the state. We'll be releasing a housing plan that helps to deal with it. But that's only gotten worse under COVID-19. And the housing support coming out of the CARES Act money is not working. And so all of those issues disproportionately affect communities of color and are all interwoven, including in terms of healthcare outcomes as well.
Speaking about housing, that is another thing that comes up, here in Keene or around the state quite a bit. Could you give me a little preview of some of the suggestions for addressing the housing crisis that you might put forth?
Sure. One thing that we need to do is continue to protect what we did in the last budget, which was to capitalize on an ongoing annual basis the Affordable Housing Fund at the statewide level. That's something surrounding states do, and for every dollar that we put into it, it leverages between $5 and $12 of federal and private investment. And what that does is it helps to incentivize and do projects including rehabbing old mill buildings into workforce affordable housing, and also developing new housing. So protecting that part of the state budget, which Chris Sununu opposed, but protect it and then build off of it so that we say New Hampshire is truly open for business when it comes to affordable housing. That's one feature. There are other elements, including dealing with some of the incentives at the local level, including dealing with, in some concrete way, density. It also involves the housing and homelessness budget. Our rapid rehousing program at the state level needs to be fully funded. We know that the housing first model stabilizes people and leads to better healthcare outcomes down the road. And so the housing and rapid housing funds in the Bureau of Housing and Homelessness at HHS, which we built up in the last budget, and by the way, Chris unilaterally cut that out of the budget, need to be sustained and built off of to maintain that housing support. We need to update our statewide homelessness plan, and in addition to that, we need to do some state level vouchers in addition to the standard Section 8 vouchers and support that we get from the federal government. There's a waiting list for Section 8 and Section 8 vouchers, and that's a big problem. And it's a problem of access. So those are just some of what we need to do. In addition, I won't go through all the details of it, but in addition, with respect to commuter rail and other infrastructure projects like that, it's important to do that in conjunction with housing development and workforce affordable housing. It only makes good sense. Those are models that have been followed in other jurisdictions. So these are just some of the ideas that we'd put in a housing plan that we will release, I believe, next week.
Bill, do I got time for one more question? You're muted.
You're right. I was. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
This is the last one I've got anyway. A lot of what's been talked about regarding the upcoming election has been concern about the security of the election, specifically around, absentee ballots and some other alternative options that people have. How big of an issue do you think that is in New Hampshire?
I trust our local election officials. I mean, they look, we're routinely ranked one of the best run elections in the country. And that's a credit to our local town and city clerks, their staff, the volunteers, everybody who works our elections do an amazing job in the state of New Hampshire. They really do. And I'm so grateful for everything they've done. The poll workers, the people, the volunteers, and stepping up and in a pandemic, showing that in New Hampshire, democracy doesn't go away just because you're in a pandemic. Those folks, just like those frontline workers that I talked about early on when we started this conversation, they're on the front lines of our democracy, working hard to make sure that everything goes as smoothly as possible. I do have a little bit of concern about not allowing some of the county and absentee ballots until election day. I think that the Secretary of State should allow some flexibility if possible. We have proposed in the past to, if necessary, in terms of helping staffing, to deploy the National Guard and plainclothes to help with staffing at select sites that need help. Other states have done that. We obviously have deployed National Guard to help with the processing of unemployment insurance applications. You know, to the extent that there is additional need and support on the ground, deploying National Guard and plainclothes to help with our local election officials that need the help, I think makes good sense. And I also think that we need to continue to talk about and stand up to the Trump administration's effort to slow down mail, and including the mail processing center in Manchester. So we need to stand up. Today, I called on Chris Sununu to renounce his support for Trump because of Trump's deeply disturbing comments yesterday, failing to adhere to the time-honored tradition of our democracy of a peaceful transfer of power and disrespect and disregard for the rule of law. People need to step up. People need to step up and stand up for our democracy. And Chris Sununu should renounce his support for Trump right away. And I know he calls himself, and I say it a lot because he says it, not me, he calls himself a Trump guy through and through, unquote. But there are bigger things at stake than party or adherence to the leader of Sununu's party. And it's our democracy. And but overall, the people in New Hampshire do democracy better than anywhere else. And I'm confident in our local election officials.